In the spring of 1942, the British High Command faced a nightmare. Japan's rising tide had swept across Southeast Asia, conquering Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Its navy now prowled the Indian Ocean, threatening the sea lanes that were Britain's lifeline to India, the Middle East, and beyond. If the Japanese secured a forward base in the western Indian Ocean, the consequences could be catastrophic. There was one place that haunted British planners more than any other: Madagascar. This vast island, sitting like a sentinel off Africa's southeastern coast, dominated the Mozambique Channel, the artery through which Allied convoys carried fuel, troops, and supplies. Control of Madagascar meant control of the shipping lanes between the Cape of Good Hope and the Suez Canal. And that moment, Madagascar was not neutral ground. It belonged to Vichy France, the collaborationist regime that had bowed to Nazi Germany after France's fall in 1940. The Vichy authorities were hostile, and their harbor at Diego Suarez, modern Antisarana, was a jewel of strategic geography. Its twin bays formed one of the finest natural anchorages in the Indian Ocean. And if Japan, already allied with Germany, were allowed to send submarines or even carriers to refuel there, the entire Indian Ocean could become a Japanese hunting ground. Convoys could be strangled, and Britain's empire in Asia might collapse altogether. Thus, in early 1942, Winston Churchill and his military chiefs resolved on a bold and little-remembered decision: to invade Madagascar before Japan could. It would be the first large-scale Allied amphibious assault of the war, months before the landings in North Africa or Sicily. The operation received its name from a flower that grew in the tropics: Operation Ironclad. Planning began in secrecy. The invasion force would sail from Durban, South Africa, with British troops joined by contingents from the Commonwealth, South Africans, Rhodesians, and men from the Royal Marines. Supporting them was a formidable fleet: carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. At its heart lay HMS Illustrious and HMS Indomitable, aircraft carriers that would provide the vital air cover. For amphibious operations, the Royal Navy had to improvise. Few specialized landing craft existed yet, so converted ships and lighters would carry men ashore. The target was clear: Diego Suarez. Its harbor was the crown jewel, but also heavily defended. Coastal artillery guarded the approaches, Vichy troops were dug in, and a handful of submarines lay in wait. Intelligence estimated around 8,000 defenders: French colonial troops, Malagasy units, and French sailors. Though not a huge garrison, their morale and loyalty were uncertain. Would they resist the British as enemies, or switch allegiance? The stakes were immense. Success would safeguard the Indian Ocean. Failure might open it to disaster. For the men in khaki who drilled on the decks of transport ships, the mission carried the thrill of novelty and danger. Many had never heard of Madagascar before. Now they were to storm its beaches. Letters home spoke of a mysterious island and a secret operation. And so, in late April 1942, the convoys slipped their moorings. South African soldiers leaned over railings, staring at the endless sea. Royal Marines checked their rifles, their minds running through the rehearsed but nerve-wracking choreography of amphibious assault. Above all, the officers knew time was short. Japanese submarines were already prowling the ocean, and if word of the expedition leaked, the enemy might strike before they reached their target. By the first days of May, the Allied fleet closed in on Madagascar's north tip. The sun rose over jungle hills and volcanic cliffs, and in the distance, the sheltered waters of Diego Suarez glimmered like a prize waiting to be seized. The men tightened to gear, the carriers prepared their aircraft, and the guns of the fleet swiveled toward the shore. The invasion was about to begin.
Dawn on May 5, 1942 broke with a haze of salt and smoke off the coast of northern Madagascar. The British fleet lay poised outside Diego Suarez Bay, a crescent of turquoise water guarded by headlands bristling with Vichy guns. For the thousands of soldiers crammed aboard transports, the long wait was over. Bugles sounded, boots thudded on steel decks, and landing craft splashed into the sea. Operation Ironclad was about to be tested in fire. The plan was intricate. Instead of a direct frontal assault into the heavily defended harbor, British commanders chose a two-pronged approach. One column of troops would land at Courier Bay, west of the town, while another would come ashore at Ambararata Bay to the east. By converging from both flanks, they hoped to cut off Diego Suarez and force a swift surrender. As the first waves of Royal Marines and British infantry clambered down rope nets into rocking landing craft, the carriers Illustrious and Indomitable launched their aircraft. Swordfish torpedo bombers, relics of an earlier age, circled overhead alongside sleek Fulmar fighters, their engines buzzing in the tropical heat. Over the fleet, the heavy guns of HMS Ramillies, a battleship already scarred from years of war, opened fire. Her shells screamed through the sky and burst against the shore batteries guarding the approaches. On land, the defenders answered. Vichy French artillery boomed from hidden positions, shells plunging into the surf around the landing craft. French and Malagasy soldiers crouched in their trenches, rifles and machine guns ready. To the British troops wading ashore through waist-high water, bullets snapped overhead and the air was thick with sand and smoke. Casualties fell in the surf, staining the foam red. Yet the British pressed forward. Royal Marines stormed Courier Bay, clearing out dug-in machine gun nests with grenades and bayonets. At Ambararata Bay, African troops of the King's African Rifles charged inland under the whine of aircraft strafing runs. By nightfall, the beachheads were secure and Allied forces were pushing through jungle trails toward Diego Suarez itself. Life on the ground quickly became a test of endurance. The heat was suffocating, mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, and the thick undergrowth clawed at uniforms and skin. Soldiers drank tepid water from canteens and marched with sweat streaming down their backs. Malagasy villagers watched silently from the edges of the roads, unsure whether to see the British as liberators or invaders. Inside Diego Suarez, the Vichy commander, Admiral Michel, prepared his defense. He had only a few thousand troops, but they were determined. The town's narrow streets were barricaded, and coastal guns still covered the harbor. At night, Vichy patrols skirmished with British advance parties, shots cracking through the darkness. On the evening of May 6th, British columns closed in from both sides. The fighting grew savage. Mortars thumped, tracer fire arced across the night, and French troops fought from stone buildings and palm groves. Yet the British advance was relentless, squeezing the defenders tighter. By dawn on May 7th, Allied forces had reached the edge of Diego Suarez. Tanks rumbled forward, supported by bayonet charges through the smoke. At last, the French commander conceded. Diego Suarez fell, and with it the crown jewel of Madagascar's defenses. For the British soldiers, the capture felt like triumph, yet relief was mixed with unease. They had taken their objective, but reports spread quickly. Vichy submarines had slipped away, and Japanese submarines might be coming. The war in the Indian Ocean was not yet finished. Indeed, within days, that fear would prove justified. The defenders were beaten, but the waters of Diego Suarez were about to erupt in fire once more.
Victory at Diego Suarez seems secure. On May 7, 1942, the Union Jack fluttered over the captured port. Allied troops patrolled the streets, and supply ships began moving into the Great Harbor. The fleet at anchor, battleships, carriers, cruisers, looked invincible, a steel wall of British power in the tropics. But beneath the calm waters of the bay, danger was already gliding silently toward them. Unbeknownst to the British, the Japanese had anticipated the importance of Madagascar.
From distant Penang, two submarines, I-10 and I-20, had been dispatched to the island's waters. They carried not only torpedoes, but something new, something deadly. Midget submarines, two-man craft designed to slip into harbors and wreak havoc. It was the same weapon used at Pearl Harbor, and now Diego Suarez would be their next target. On the night of May 30th, 1942, as the British fleet rested at anchor, two midget subs were launched into the black waters. Silent, almost invisible, they crept past the entrance defenses and into the heart of the harbor. Just before midnight, lookouts aboard HMS Ramillies, the venerable battleship that had bombarded the island shores only weeks before, spotted a strange wake. Moments later, the sea erupted. A torpedo slammed into Ramillies' port side, ripping open her hull and sending a shudder through the massive ship. Alarms wailed, sailors scrambled to their stations, and damage control parties rushed below decks waist-deep in rising water. Yet the old battleship refused to die. Her watertight compartments held, and though she listed, she stayed afloat. The second torpedo found another target, a tanker moored in the harbor. The blast tore the ship apart, flames billowing skyward, lighting the night like a beacon. Sailors dove overboard, the surface of the water burning as oil slicks ignited. For hours, chaos reigned in Diego Suarez. Searchlights sweeping the bay, depth charges hammering the sea, ships maneuvering frantically in the confined waters. The midget submarines never escaped. One was cornered and sunk, the other ran aground. Its two crewmen, young Japanese sailors, struggled ashore armed only with pistols. For days they evaded capture, living off the land and aided by Malagasy villagers sympathetic to Japan's stand against colonial powers. Eventually, surrounded by British patrols, the men chose death over surrender. Their bodies were later buried with military honors by the British themselves, a gesture of respect toward opponents who had fought with quiet, desperate courage. For the British, the attack was a sobering reminder. Even in victory, the seas around Madagascar were not secure. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks. If Japanese subs could reach Diego Suarez, could Japanese carriers be far behind? Sailors worked tirelessly to repair Ramillies, shoring up her wounds with steel patches. Convoy commanders, meanwhile, redoubled their vigilance, knowing the Mozambique Channel was still a hunting ground. The capture of Diego Suarez had given Britain a vital foothold, but it was not the end of the struggle for Madagascar. Far to the south and west, Vichy forces still held the island's interior and southern ports. The campaign would drag on for months, through jungle marches, mountain passes, and skirmishes with determined defenders. The forgotten island was proving to be anything but quiet. Yet the night of the submarine attack lingered in every memory. Diego Suarez had shown not just the courage of its defenders, but the reach of Japan's navy, a chilling reminder that the Indian Ocean was no safe backwater. For Britain, the war on Madagascar was far from finished. Its climax still lay ahead.
The thunder of guns at Diego Suarez had faded, but the war for Madagascar was not yet finished. Though the jewel of the north had fallen, the island itself stretched more than 1,000 miles long, a land of mountains, rainforests, and vast plateaus. Vichy France still held most of it, and its Governor-General, Armand Léon Hennet, refused to surrender. For Britain, leaving the rest of the island in enemy hands was unthinkable. The Indian Ocean sea lanes had to be secured completely. So began the slow, grinding second phase of Operation Ironclad. Through the summer of 1942, British and Commonwealth troops fanned out from Diego Suarez, pushing south. Their opponents were a patchwork of French colonial troops, Senegalese tirailleurs, and Malagasy soldiers loyal to Vichy. Though outnumbered and cut off from reinforcement, they fought with determination, ambushing convoys and defending strongpoints carved into the rugged highlands. The campaign was not a grand clash of fleets, but a series of bitter marches and firefights in an unforgiving land. For the soldiers on both sides, life became a test of endurance. British troops struggled with heat, torrential rains, and endless mosquitoes. Malaria stalked the ranks as cruelly as bullets.
Supply lines stretched across primitive roads where trucks bogged down in mud or broke on rocky slopes. Yet Allied determination pressed them onward. At every village and ridge, there was another skirmish. Small, sharp battles in which local civilians often stood silently by, wary of both sides. By September 1942, British command prepared for the final blow. Amphibious landings were staged along Madagascar's western coast to outflank the Vichy defenders. Troops stormed ashore at Mahajanga, and later at Tamatave, Tuamasina, meeting stiff but brief resistance before seizing the ports. Each success tightened the noose around the Vichy garrisons. The decisive push came in November. Allied forces advanced on the capital and Tananarivo through steep roads and mountain passes. The defenders, exhausted and cut off, fought hard but could not stop the advance. On November 6, 1942, Governor Annette finally bowed to reality. He signed the formal surrender of Madagascar to British forces, ending 6 months of fighting on the forgotten island. For Britain, the victory was strategic, not glorious. Madagascar had been secured before Japan could exploit it, and the sea lanes through the Mozambique Channel remained open. The operation had also given the Allies invaluable experience in amphibious warfare, lessons that would be used months later in North Africa, and ultimately on the beaches of Normandy. For Madagascar, the war left a more complex legacy. The island, ruled by Vichy, had been dragged into the global conflict without its people's consent. Malagasy soldiers had fought and died on both sides, while civilians had endured bombings, disease, and hunger. Yet their land had also become a pivot in world strategy, its harbors and coasts shaping the course of the Indian Ocean War. In London, Churchill hailed the operation as a success. In Tokyo, the loss of Madagascar closed the door to Japanese ambitions in the Western Indian Ocean. And in Madagascar itself, the memory of 1942 lingered, a time when a distant war came crashing onto its shores, and the island briefly became the center of the world's attention. Operation Ironclad faded quickly from popular memory, overshadowed by the titanic battles of North Africa, Normandy, and the Pacific. But for those who fought there, for the sailors who braved torpedoes in Diego Suarez, the soldiers who hacked through jungle trails, and the Malagasy people caught in the storm, it remained unforgettable. Madagascar had been invaded, contested, and secured. The sea lanes of empire were safe once more. And the forgotten invasion of 1942 slipped into history, a quiet cornerstone of the Allied war effort.